They were a wealthy California family living the perfect life.
They were well-connected, very successful, wonderful people.
Until it was all shattered by unimaginable violence.
People slain in their own home on Easter Sunday. That was a shock.
This case was like a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle.
The investigation would take detectives on a 3-year manhunt ranging from the farms of Fresno to international drug cartels to catch a killer driven by greed.
Some referred to it as Fresno County's crime of the century.
You just couldn't imagine the level of evilness.
April 21st, 1992. Around 9 a.m., police in Fresno, California receive a panicked call from the housekeeper of a local millionaire, 59-year-old businessman Dale Ewell.
Housekeeper Juanita Avita arrived at her usual time. She came into the house and she immediately noticed that a door that leads to the kitchen was closed, which was highly unusual. She went in and at that point saw Tiffany laying face down in a puddle of blood. She then ran over to the neighbor's house and the police were called.
Tiffany Ewell is Dale's 24-year-old daughter. When officers arrive, they immediately see she's been dead for some time.
When we first went inside, you could see as you walked into the kitchen the body of Tiffany. She was laying down with her head kind of pointed towards the southeast next to the dining room table. We surmised that she had been shot in the back of the head, just from where the blood was.
But when police search the rest of the house, they discover Tiffany is not the only victim.
There's a hallway that goes to the east from the dining room. And as we walked that way, it went into like a den or a study area. You could see the body of Glee. And as we walked that direction, you could see that the body of Dale was laying in another hallway just outside the den. He had a bunch of newspapers in his hand underneath him and around him.
They discovered it was not one death, but 3.
Tiffany, her 57-year-old mother Glee, and her father Dale have all been shot. But why would anyone murder a family like the Ewells?
The family was a very prominent family in Fresno County. They were well-connected, very successful, wonderful people, and by all counts, a happy family.
Dale was a retired Air Force pilot from Ohio, and Glee was a former teacher. They'd gotten married in 1961 and moved to California to start a new life together.
Dale was involved in airplane business and made a good living through that as well as through farming. His wife Glee was known for being involved in the community as a volunteer in different ways.
In 1967, Glee gave birth to their first child, Tiffany. Their son Dana came 4 years later in 1971. By then, Dale had become so successful that he invested in agricultural real estate. He soon amassed an $8 million fortune. Glee quit teaching to devote her time to philanthropy.
Glee was a community activist, just a wonderful person who did a great deal of volunteer work within the community.
Glee was a force of nature in a very nice way. She was an appointee to the State Bar Board of Governors. She also became the executive director of the Fresno Regional Foundation.
Everybody seemed to, in most circles, know either Dale or Glee. They were very successful in what they did.
But you'd never know the Ewells were millionaires by looking at them.
Fresno is a great community. We are based in agriculture. Everyone in the community is either a farmer, works for a farmer, or had family that was a farmer.
The Ewells had more wealth than most people in Fresno, and being able to fly airplanes and drive Mercedes and that sort of thing. But, aside from those kinds of trappings, I wouldn't call them a flashy family.
The Ewells did not flaunt their wealth at all. For the amount of money that they were worth, they were very, very conservative.
They made sure their children were given the opportunity to succeed as well. By 1992, Tiffany was a grad student at Fresno State, while Dana was studying business at Santa Clara University.
Glee's children, I gathered, were a bit different. Tiffany, their daughter, was far more quiet, reserved, but wonderful in her way, and Glee would speak glowingly about her.
She was just a very nice young lady who was reserved, did not have a ton of friends that she would socialize with. She was more family-oriented, but everybody who knew her seemed to like her.
Dana was clearly the apple of Glee's eye. She spoke with great passion about his outgoing personality, his intellectual capabilities, his business acumen.
Dana stood out as a intense, well-groomed, corporate type of young man.
Dale and Dana had a fairly good father-son relationship.
They were, by all counts, a happy family.
But now, 3 members of the Ewell family have been brutally murdered, and Fresno police are determined to find out why.
It was what we call a triple, in the fact that this was an affluent family in a decent part of town, and not your typical victims. So the whole unit responded out to this particular scene.
Coming up, if someone is targeting the Ewell family, could Dana be next?
We didn't know if Dana Ewell was still alive. We didn't know if he had not been massacred somewhere between their house and wherever he was. We just didn't know.
Millionaire Dale Ewell, his wife Glee, and their daughter Tiffany have been murdered in their Fresno, California home. And as investigators search the crime scene, the evidence begins to paint a disturbing picture.
A homicide scene tells a story, and this one told a pretty clear story.
The way the bodies were all spread out, it kind of gave us an idea on how the crime had gone down.
It was clear that Tiffany was killed first, that she did not know what was coming. She was just standing in the kitchen and got shot in the back of the head.
She was probably dead before she hit the floor. We believe that Glee saw this happen and actually saw the killer.
Glee then ran from Tiffany's killer, ran into a den that she was shot multiple times.
As she laid on the ground on her side, the killer stood above her, and she actually looked up at him and was trying to basically, I guess, say no. And he shot her again while standing above her.
She had her keys in her hand and in death had a look of fright on her face.
After shooting the 2 women, it appears the killer then ambushed Dale.
As he's walking down the hallway, the killer comes out from a bedroom and shoots him once in the head. And I think he was dead before he hit the ground also.
The blood has dried, which tells police the attack occurred some time ago. But was it the result of a robbery gone wrong, or something else?
There was a box of 9mm shells in the nightstand in the master bedroom. And apparently Dale had a gun that went with that, a 9mm handgun, that was missing.
The home had been ransacked quite a bit, and so the initial thought was that this could be a burglary. But upon closer inspection, there were a lot of inconsistencies with the burglary.
We scoured the house, every entryway, every nook and cranny that anybody could get through that house. No signs of forced entry, the way the drawers were opened and then closed. Burglars didn't do that. You leave them open so you don't touch them twice. It was, we felt, to make it look like a burglary had occurred and that Glee and Tiffany and Dale had interrupted a burglar.
In fact, the evidence seems to suggest that whoever did this was a professional.
Normally, we would expect to find just hair strands, fingerprints, a point of entry. It was incredible how little forensics was able to find in a 4-day inspection.
We really didn't find much of anything except the expended rounds. The precision of the shots, especially to Tiffany and Dale, one shot to the head, this is a hit.
But why would a killer target Dale and his family on Easter weekend? When investigators talked to neighbors, they learned the Ewells spent the holiday weekend at their beach house in nearby Pajaro Dunes. Their son Dana had returned from college to go with them.
We didn't know there was a family member missing until we did some interviews with some people who knew the family. We're concerned that maybe he's to be another victim.
At the time of the murders, Dana was a student at Santa Clara University. Law enforcement had to follow up to make sure that he was safe.
Thankfully, they find Dana safe at school. He flies back to Fresno to speak with investigators.
Dana had said he was trying to reach the family and couldn't.
He did not react in a way that one would expect. He didn't shed tears over it.
Didn't show any emotion. And part of that could have been shock.
Do you know of any reason why anybody would want your family dead? Nothing,
and he said that he didn't know of anyone who would want his family dead, other than saying that his father was involved with some pretty high-level individuals, and he didn't know if any of those people could have wanted his family dead.
Dana tells investigators he last saw his family 2 days ago at Easter dinner. He brought his girlfriend and her family to meet them.
He's dating at the time the daughter of an FBI agent in San Jose.
They invited them to dinner there at the beach house. So there's Dana and Monica, his girlfriend, and then her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Zent. It was apparently a great dinner, and then when they all left,
Dana went back with the Zents to their home. Dale flew home, and Glee and Tiffany drove home.
Dale didn't like all of them flying together or all of them driving together because he was worried that if something were to happen, he didn't want the whole family to die together. He wanted somebody to be alive.
Ironically, that meant Dale would arrive too late to save his wife and daughter. By the time he gets home, his family members have already been killed. But detectives find the timing rather curious.
Tiffany and Glee had gotten home first. When they got into the dining room, the killer was waiting in the family room just around a corner.
Approximately 30 minutes later, Dale ended up coming home through the garage. Why would a person who just committed 2 murders wait 30 to 40 minutes for somebody else to come home? That was very strange.
Coming up, investigators discovered that the Ewells had some powerful enemies.
These people were targeted to die, period. That gets you back to the question, who benefits by this hit?
Three members of the Ewell family have been murdered during the Easter holidays. Police believe the gunman had access to the house, but the sole survivor, the Ewell's son Dana, has an airtight alibi.
At the time of the murders, he's with the FBI agent's family, hours away from the Ewell home.
They checked out everything he had said, and he had been with Monica over in the Santa Clara area.
The autopsy report provides investigators with a few more cryptic clues.
The pathologist recovered the bullets from the bodies, and the bullets looked like something that law enforcement, at least in Fresno, had never seen before.
Some of the expended rounds that we had found in Glee had some really unique striation marks.
The detectives put quite a bit of work into figuring out what could possibly have made those striations.
The bullets turned out to be a match for the ones found on the nightstand in Dale and Glee's bedroom.
We believe that the killer knew that those rounds were there, used those rounds to load up his gun, and committed the murders, and then stole the 9mm also.
There are also traces of a strange substance.
One of the other things we found were microscopic little bitty pieces of yellow fuzz, if you will. Little pieces of yellow material on Glee's clothing. We didn't know what that was.
The evidence only raises more questions. But by now, the triple homicide has made the news, and Fresno police feel the pressure to come up with answers.
It was a case that, frankly, fascinated me. I watched it in the news. I reviewed all the media and wondered where this case was going to end up.
We had to find a motive. So they started to look into backgrounds of Dale, Glee, and Tiffany to see what they could find out. Talking to family members, talking to friends, talking to whoever, find out what they were into.
Dana spoke highly of Tiffany and said that she was a harmless creature and that he couldn't think of anyone who would possibly want to hurt Tiffany.
She was Daddy's little girl. She was very protected by her parents. She had apparently been in an accident when she was younger and received some trauma to her brain. And from everything we could find, she didn't have a mean bone in her body. There was no reason why she needed to be killed.
During the course of the investigation, authorities discovered that Glee hadn't always been an unassuming teacher.
Earlier in her life, she had worked for the CIA. And I went, wow, well, that's a big deal. So that was something they looked into. And it turned out not to be a covert type of position in the CIA. It was something a little less glamorous.
In recent years, she'd become an outspoken civic activist. Was it possible she'd made enemies of the wrong people?
Glee was in a position of power, serving on a high-level state bar committee, and was involved in decision-making that could have led someone to become very upset with her.
People do crazy things, and we didn't know if maybe someone who wanted to be a judge got passed over and just got fed up with it.
We had to eliminate those people as possible suspects.
As investigators dig further, they find out Dale was in business with some dangerous people as well.
He took over a business from a guy who went to prison.
The person who owned Western Piper apparently had gotten some problems with running drugs with planes, and Dale swooped in and bought the company out from under him. The detectives were wondering at the time, is he mad that he lost his business the way he did?
Were the Ewells executed on the orders of a drug runner?
There was a lot of territorial gang violence where gangs were fighting over where the lines were drawn for their territory.
We had the Bloods, we had the Crips, we have NF, or Nuestra Familia. We had an influx of Asian gangs when the Hmongs came into the Central Valley, and a lot of them settled in the Fresno area. But one of our biggest problems was the Bulldog gang. They've been a thorn in the side of law enforcement for a long time in this area. They were kind of independent from everybody else, and there's different sects. They really have no hierarchy. They fight each other. They've been a problem in the Fresno County area for a long time.
Gang murders were pretty much at an all-time high. I believe the murders that year were over 100.
Detectives learned that Dale's plane was stolen the day after the murders. They immediately put out an alert, hoping it might connect them to the cartels. But instead, the lead takes them somewhere unexpected.
Dale apparently had a plane at Western Piper who belonged to an attorney out of Las Vegas. And apparently the plane had needed some work done. The attorney had actually gone and got his plane. He went and jumped in and got his plane out of there. The timing was really bad on the attorney's part. That's something that they talked to him about. He was interviewed, and that was put to rest.
Fresno police have hit a dead end at every turn so far. But have they been asking the right questions?
All the possible motives, it really comes back to who's going to benefit from this.
Coming up, one name keeps coming back to the top of their list.
He studied billionaires. He wrote to billionaires. He asked for jobs with people who were billionaires.
Detectives investigating the Ewell family murders have been unable to come up with any solid leads, but they soon realize that they looked past one suspect a little too early.
Who stands to gain the amount of money that these people are worth? And that came back to Dana.
As the sole surviving family member, Dana stands to inherit Dale and Glee's entire $8 million estate. But is he capable of murder?
Dana's personality was completely the opposite of anybody in his immediate family. I would describe him as eccentric. When he was in high school, he would wear suits and carry a briefcase. He would flash money. He would buy girls that he liked expensive bottles of perfume. Everybody in the school was aware of Dana Ewell and his love for money.
He kept a collection of billionaires. Most kids his age are collecting baseball and football cards, and here he is. His idea of, collecting memorabilia was about people who had become billionaires and millionaires.
He studied billionaires. He wrote to billionaires. We even had some of the copies of letters. We refer to it as the billionaire collection.
He was clearly aiming for a position of prominence in the world and wanted to be regarded as a wealthy businessman.
Investigators have already confirmed Dana was nowhere near his family's home the day of the murders. But his behavior begins to raise suspicion, starting with the funerals.
He was very cheap about buying coffins for his family members, and the way he reacted at the funeral by treating it more like a social event than the way that you would expect any normal human being to act.
He was working the room. He commented on a lady's diamond ring. He was not acting like the grieving son. As detectives, that's where your spidey senses start to come in. Not only did he do that, but he didn't want to cooperate with us anymore. He actually got an attorney, and he wanted us to go through his attorney to talk to him, and which was really bizarre for a sole survivor of a family. When your family's been murdered, you don't want to work with the law enforcement agency that's trying to solve the case.
He acts even more strangely at the reading of the will.
Dana found out for the first time that his father had set up the trust so that he would not get any money until he was 35, which was more than a decade away.
He jumped up and he slammed his hand on the table and he said, "Why did my father do this to me?" And that shocked everyone. Dale's brothers, they said this isn't right, and they brought their concerns to Detective Souza and Detective Burke at that time.
Greed is a powerful motive, and police know that Dana didn't have to pull the trigger himself to be involved.
There are the allegations that young Dana Ewell wants to inherit $7 or $8 million from his parents. He's willing to hire a gunman to kill his mother, his father, his sister on Easter Sunday.
There was a lot of investigation to do up in Santa Clara regarding Dana and just finding out about him and what he was all about.
Classmates tell detectives they should speak with Dana's best friend, Joel Radovich.
It was a weird friendship because Joel was diametrically different than Dana. Dana, this arrogant $1,000 suit rich boy, and Joel, the scrubby, sleeps wherever he can find a place, rides a skateboard, new wave hippie type.
His whole contention that he wasn't really close with Dana and, saw him a little bit, but, they weren't really that as tight as people on campus had made them out to be.
Joel confirms everything Dana told them, but detectives soon discover that both young men are lying.
Now we've got two people that people say are really close, and they're both saying, no, they're not really close. And one of the detectives happened to see Joel driving down the freeway, and he followed him, and he was actually staying at Dana's house.
The hallway still had blood and gray matter from Dale's brain on the sides of the walls. So on a daily basis, Dana and Joel are walking past the blood and gray matter from Dana's father as if it's no big deal.
When we started to key on Dana and Joel as having something to do with the homicides is when we decided to start setting up the surveillances.
For someone unemployed, Joel seems to be living very well.
Dana paid for Joel's helicopter flight lessons in Fresno and didn't even hide it. We were able to show that Dana withdrew $125,000 in cash, that Joel spent about $75,000 in cash.
But Joel hasn't spent all of the money on flight lessons. He's also bought several books that investigators find incriminating.
Books that we were able to discover that Joel obtained was a book called Hitman. It was how you do your job as a professional hitman. It was generally pretty well written, but it had horrible pieces of advice in it. One was, if you are questioned by police, ask, "Are you going to arrest me?" That's exactly what Joel did.
The manual also contains instructions on how to build a silencer.
That coupled with taking the flying lessons, I think he wanted to be an international hitman. You know, I don't know. I don't think he had any other goal in life.
Coming up, investigators believe they've found their gunman. Now they just have to prove it.
We have to put together a really strong case because neither of these individuals had any history of violence.
After a year of investigation, Fresno police are tracking two suspects in the brutal murders of the Ewell family. Dale and Glee's wealth-obsessed son, Dana, and his best friend, Joel, who's been studying to be a hitman. At this point, gone back to school in Santa Clara, and Joel has moved to L.A.
The way they would get a hold of each other was to page each other.
Think back to the early 90s, so we're talking about people still using payphones, people still using pagers.
To keep tabs on the pair, detectives obtain a warrant to clone Joel's pager.
Every time Joel would get a page from Dana, we would get the same page.
There were a couple payphones located at a location not too far from where he lived, and he would go to that location. They were able to basically have all of these different vehicles following Joel and communicating over the radio as to who would take over next. And if you were an expert in surveillance and you were being followed by this group, you would never have known it.
When they started talking, we could send a detective up with a tape recorder in a backpack and go to the other phone and just act like he was having a conversation, hope to get Joel's side of the conversation.
The recordings seem to confirm police suspicions.
He referred to the three-shirt deal, meaning the three family members, and that he needed money and he needed to get out of town.
He actually said, "I want my money and I want it now," because things were stretching out so long. Dana was extremely careful on where he would go, what payphones he would go to, unlike Joel. So it was a little more difficult to get Dana's side of the conversation.
So on May 13th, 1993, investigators paid Dana a visit to try and rattle him.
So they decided to go to Santa Clara University and knock on Dana's dorm door. And Chris Curtis looked at him and said, "We know who killed your family. It was Joel Radovich." Dana then immediately shut the door in Detective Curtis's face.
As soon as we told Dana that we think Joel killed his parents, Dana leaves campus and paged Joel. And that's when things really started to ramp up.
The surveillance team follows Joel to a restaurant in Ontario, California, where they observe him talking to a bartender named Jack Ponce. Detectives want to know why.
Jack Ponce was about the same age as Joel. He and Joel had been friends since they were children.
We need to go and talk to Jack Ponce. Interviewing him was like pulling teeth.
Ponce denies any knowledge of the murders, but after several visits, investigators eventually get him to open up.
You mentioned that the 380, let's go back to that. The 380 was yours, the 22 was yours. Actually, not the 22.
I remember asking him early on if he had a 9mm, and he said no, he didn't. I think it was the 5th interview, finally. He goes, I bought a 9mm. I go, what kind of 9mm did you have? Oh, it's an 18-9. It's a really nasty-looking gun. He said he had bought it to shoot squirrels in the attic, which was quite a gun to shoot squirrels with.
Ponce conveniently claims that the gun had been stolen. Hoping to prove it was the murder weapon, investigators compare several AT-9 barrels with the bullet markings from the crime scene.
It just turns out that this particular gun had a very unique twist in the barrel.
The criminalists then recreated the exact silencer that the book described, got an AT-9, and then fired numerous rounds through that silencer.
And that silencer is made with PVC pipe, and you stack it with tennis balls and steel wool. The striation mark came out. They were almost identical to the striation marks on the bullets that were recovered in Glee's body.
The test also explains the fuzzy material found on Glee's clothing.
The fuzz was pieces of tennis ball, the little yellow tennis balls.
Ponce is immediately arrested. It doesn't take him long to turn on Joel Radovich.
He basically spilled it that he had bought the gun, and for Joel.
Ponce says Joel told him exactly how he committed the murders while they were getting rid of the gun.
Joel made the decision to tell Jack what happened, not because he was confessing, but because you're in this too, buddy, and you need to keep your mouth shut.
Joel said, I shaved all the hair off my body except for my eyelashes and my eyebrows so I wouldn't leave any trace, and I was sitting on a plastic sheet waiting for the three to come home.
There were so many different facts that Jack Ponce knew that he couldn't have known on his own through the media or from anybody but Joel Radovich.
That level of planning that went into the murders was just something that Fresno hadn't experienced.
Ponce even agrees to show investigators where to find the murder weapon.
Joel gave a bag of gun parts, the murder weapon plus the 9mm that was stolen from the scene, to Jack Ponce to get rid of. Jack said he had thrown the parts at a variety of places down in San Fernando Valley, and the barrel of the murder weapon, he said he buried it in a vacant lot in Reseda.
3 years after the murders, who knows at that point if an apartment building or a house has been built on that lot.
He's handcuffed and shackled. He looks down, he goes, right about here. 2 shovels full, we hit something. Started digging around, it was the barrel. You get that piece of information that you know, that aha moment when you go, this son of a bitch did it.
Coming up, investigators are close to making arrests. But will the rich kid get away with murder?
People will look on the outside and say, well, this will be an easy trial. It was not an easy trial.
Bartender Jack Ponce has confessed to participating in a plot to kill millionaire Dale Ewell and his family. And according to Ponce, 21-year-old Dana Ewell was the one pulling the strings.
He was really a turning point in that case, explaining how Dana devised the plan, how he recruited Joel, and how the whole case unfolded. There was an estate worth $7 or $8 million that he reasoned he would collect if there were no other heirs in front of him.
It takes detectives some time to gather all the evidence, but on March 2nd, 1995, the 2 remaining conspirators are finally arrested.
It took 3 years before investigators could arrest Dana and Joel. Part of that is Dana's alibi, backed up by an FBI agent.
We had to continue the investigation for much longer than would normally be done if the individuals were the types that had a significant criminal history. It would be difficult for a jury to find beyond a reasonable doubt that they committed such heinous murders.
It was 3 counts of murder with 3 special circumstances, so it was a death penalty case.
A string of motions and appeals tie up the case for several more years. Prosecutors use the time to build a stronger case.
This case was like a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. There were 162 witnesses who testified in this trial. It was building block upon building block.
They laid out a very clear timeline of how Dana organized it with his friend Joel. He provided himself an alibi by going and seeing his girlfriend and having dinner with her family, and her father was an FBI agent.
In 1997, Dana Ewell and Joel Radovich stand trial. Prosecutors come armed with a money trail they use to argue that Dana paid to have his family killed.
We were able to show that Joel was given $125,000 in cash by Dana for no apparent reason other than tying him to the murders.
Joel wants to be a hitman. Then you look at Dana and he hires everybody to do his dirty work. You know, throwing the money out there.
Their star witness, Jack Ponce, provides the jury with all the details of the plot. But the defense argues that Ponce is an unreliable witness who is only implicating Dana in exchange for immunity.
Anytime a witness is given immunity, their credibility is going to be suspect.
Dana's attorneys took the tack that you can't believe a word that Ponce says.
His testimony was something I thought should have been inadmissible, but it was, well, Joel Radovich told me that Dana Ewell told him, and so you had what's called double hearsay. So the prosecution had to offer an exception, double exception to the hearsay rule there in order to introduce that.
While Dana may be guilty of choosing the wrong friends, the defense insists there is no actual evidence linking him to the crimes.
They had what you would call guilt by association, the relationship between my client and Joel Radovich. So they had, them living together after the murders at the Ewell residence for a while, the paying for helicopter flying lessons, guilt by association evidence.
After an 8-month trial, the jury finally renders a verdict.
It may have been one of the longest deliberations in a criminal case in Fresno County history.
We returned guilty on all counts and also guilty on all enhancements and allegations.
Some people cried, some people laughed, a whole range of emotions because it was such a long case.
However, there's one thing the jury can't agree on.
In California, it has to be a unanimous death verdict. This wasn't, so that left them with the only thing of life without parole, which is mandatory on a death case if the jury can't decide on death. I was extremely glad that I didn't have to sign that verdict as the foreman sentencing them to death. I was very relieved. Now, I had voted the death penalty, but I was glad I didn't have to sign that paper with my name.
To investigators, it's a fitting sentence. In his greed, Dana Ewell had been willing to do anything to become a billionaire. Instead, he destroyed his family and lost everything, including his freedom.
To see a family massacred and then ultimately by a child strips away a bit of the veneer of our comfort, of our society.
I really believe that Dana had a short circuit or a disconnect. He was arrogant. He thought he was the smartest person in the room. To this day, I have no sympathy for him whatsoever.
This guy's a perfect psychopath.
I have always thought, at least for Dana, that the worst day of his life was not the day that he was arrested. The worst day of his life was not the day he was convicted. The worst day was the day his last appeal expired. And now he knows every day for the rest of his life, his home is prison.
I remember the moment when it sunk in that somebody had stolen my child.
It was, always the bigger cities that had this kind of trouble.
She walked her normal route down the street and gone.
How could that happen in that short distance where everybody knows everybody in a small town?
It's just amazing what a split second can do.
Somebody out there knows what happened. The person that did this is still out there.
Just one little break and they can solve this.
The truth always comes out.
McCleary, Washington is a small town, just over 2 square miles. A place where parents don't worry about their kids playing outside. It's just a short walk home from a friend's house on a hot summer night. 10-year-old Lindsey has less than a half mile to go to get home, down quiet residential streets, across one of the main roads in town, and past the gas station. It usually takes her about 10 minutes. I'm Paul Holes. This is Real Life Nightmare.
I thought it was a safe little quiet town.
Well, Clary's like a lot of these county towns in Grace Harbor County, 16, 17, 1,800 people.
It's partway between Olympia and the ocean. I mean, it really has a sense that this is a friendly town. This is a nice place to live.
I had just separated from my ex-husband a few months before we moved to McCleary. And I was having trouble with daycare. So we moved to McCleary because one of my oldest friends said, well, I can watch your kids before and after school, but you have to move out here.
It's just, I would say, a quiet, comfortable place to raise kids. It's just a quiet place to be.
I remember as I came down the hill into town thinking, this is such a cute little town.
I mean, it was a little town, still is. Kids ran around, everybody watched over everybody's children, people didn't lock their doors.
McCleary became home for the Baum family. Mom, Melissa, son, Josh, 12, and Lindsey, who was 10 years old. Like a lot of preteens in 2009, Lindsey is crazy about a young adult book series set right there in the Pacific Northwest.
Twilight was her big thing at the time.
On your left.
She was very into movies. She had become an 80s movie buff, which I, of course, loved because she was falling in love with all my old favorites. She'd gotten a hold of some of my old VHS tapes, and I think Dream a Little Dream was probably her favorite, that or The Lost Boys.
In McCleary, Lindsey and her friends are a regular sight around town.
I talked to the ladies at the main store here in town, and they said, yeah, she used to come in quite a bit. And that's how it was with that little group.
I used to say she came out of the womb talking. And that was really the only thing she ever got in trouble in school for, was talking. She was quite the little chatterbox.
You saw her little group of kids walking around town, and I would look out the gas station out my department window, and there she'd be walking across the street with her friends. It was not uncommon to see her in the area. My daughter did that too at that age.
June 26, 2009. What's a fun summer night? Time to go out and play.
Hot. It was a really hot day that day. It was kind of off the record hot that year. She had been hanging out with her friends. One of the other girls in town that lived just up the street from us had a pool in their backyard. They spent the day there swimming. They came back and forth to my house several times, but most of the day they were hanging out over there and swimming and just enjoying being out of school. They wanted Michaela to stay with us. She had stayed the night before. So their plan was they were going to go down to Michaela's to get some clothes because they thought she was going to stay the night with us again.
She went with her brother Josh, and for some reason they got into a tiff, and he ended up going back home.
For whatever reason, once they got to Michaela's house, Michaela was told no. They were going somewhere the next day or something, so she wasn't able to. Lindsey headed home alone.
Here in the Northwest, the sun just does not set until way late. So even 9 o'clock, sun's still high in the sky, and it starts to get towards dusk as you get towards 10 o'clock. But in the summertime, kids are out running around. People are out mowing their yards late at night because it's still sunny.
She never left her cell phone, ever, except for that night. She had left it on the charger. And she usually took our German Shepherd. But that night she didn't. They were in a hurry because she wanted to get back before dark. They were just going to go down, get Michaela's clothes, and come straight back. She should have been back in 20 minutes tops.
It's a relatively straight shot from where she was to her home. McClary is a small town, so it was 8 to 10 blocks exactly to her house.
She always came home when she was supposed to. She checked in like she was supposed to. She had a cell phone, so if I couldn't find her, I'd call her. But she was always home, before dark. I always knew where she was. I kept calling Lindsey's cell phone, and at that point I hadn't realized it was in her bedroom, plugged in. And so I kept calling her, like, Lindsey, hurry up and get home. Where are you at?
Once it got dark, after 10 o'clock, that's when things got serious, and Melissa decided it was time to call the McClary Police Department.
That's when I really started to panic because I knew she wouldn't just be out after dark. That just wasn't her. She didn't like to be outside after dark. So I knew at that point something wasn't right.
School had just let out for the summer, and it was unseasonably hot, crazy hot for McClary for that time of year.
For Lindsey, this was a chance to go be with her friends.
She'd just finished the 5th grade. She was just having fun hanging out with her friends.
Lindsey and her friend Michaela have a plan for the evening.
Went to Michaela's house to see if she can do a sleepover. She went with her brother Josh, and for some reason they got into a tiff, and he ended up going back home.
When they got to her friend's residence, they said, nah, the sleepover's not a good idea. At about 9:30, it was starting to get dusk. It was still light, but they said, Lindsey knew she needed to get home. So she left and was headed to her residence. The officer working the shift that night was told that Lindsey Baum hadn't come home and that she was last seen at a friend's house. He began looking around, talking to the mom, and then checking the local areas where kids would go.
Melissa had, by that point, had already called everybody in Lindsey's cell phone contact list. Nobody had seen her since she left the friend's house.
Right away, we tried to do the Amber Alert. And unfortunately, I guess there's criteria that you need for the Amber Alert, and we didn't have that, a vehicle, what she was wearing at the time. And so we could not do an Amber Alert. So we continued to, call in other people to help us, and it just got bigger and bigger and bigger.
The McClary police searched through the night, contacted the Grace Harbor County Sheriff's Office for additional manpower. And from there, it just grew exponentially and very quickly as to the number of agencies and people involved trying to find her.
It set in that this is highly unusual because by then we'd already checked all the normal places that she would be? Was it parental interference? Did she run away because I guess her and her brother got in an argument and, she didn't want to be around him or something? So we thought, well, maybe she's just a runaway, she's hiding. And then it got where nobody knew where she was. And this is just not right.
Lindsey didn't have a cell phone, she didn't have any money, she had no way to really facilitate her own disappearance. So we didn't think it was a runaway situation. We didn't think she was hiding.
It was going through my mind like, it's fine, she's gonna show up, like stuff like this doesn't happen here. And it was very surreal. It was several hours before it really dawned on me that somebody had taken my child. I think that initially popped in my head, and I just kept pushing it away, and thinking, oh man, when she gets here, I'm going to wear her out and lock her in her room for a year. I tried not to jump to conclusions right away, but what are you supposed to do? She wouldn't have been out after dark. I knew that for a fact.
We didn't have any major crimes. It was, always the bigger cities that had this kind of trouble. I always pushed for 5 officers, but I believe at the time we had 4. It's a small community with a small police budget.
In the early morning hours of Saturday, they still hadn't found her. And so I told them to arrange for some search and rescue resources to be activated at daylight on Saturday if she hadn't been found by then, and to use those resources to assist in searching the community. Like I said, McClary's a small community. At the time, it had right around 1,000 to 1,500 people living in it, and wasn't that large geographically, so figured we could search it pretty effectively with some search and rescue volunteers.
Almost immediately after that, the FBI was there, and so we knew, oh no, this means it's not good news. This is now serious.
McCleary is a pretty small agency. Grays Harbor County Sheriff is also relatively small. What we essentially bring is manpower and resources. We've got specialists in the field of child abductions. We have behavioral analysts. We have CAST, which is our cell phone analysis agents who are specialized in digital and social media and cell phone analysis. We have planes, we have drones, we have evidence response teams. Basically, we have any kind of specialty that you need to investigate any kind of crime. We can provide somebody who can provide that resource to a local agency.
We had missing children's organizations coming in. We had the sheriff going through the jail getting volunteers to go out, inmates. And they went out and they did a good job. A brushy area, they took it down to the soil. And with all the searches done, very little evidence that we could see. It just like she just disappeared at her halfway point from home.
Everybody was looking at everybody else, looking at family members, looking at friends.
Lindsey was on a walk that was pretty finite, right in her own neighborhood. She just disappeared into thin air. You have a pretty finite group of suspects.
Really, the first few days, especially, probably the first few weeks, are such a fog to me. They were just kind of looking at everybody at that point. They were doing roadblocks and passing out flyers and, doing door to door. It was chaos.
Somebody had to see something. It was a hot day. Everybody's out probably on their front porches in McClary just trying to cool off. Not a lot of AC in East County, Grays Harbor, so.
If you were in McClary between 9 and 10 o'clock on that night, we wanted to talk to you. We wanted to know what you saw, who you saw, vehicles you saw, what you were doing. If you were out for a walk, if you were letting the dog out, it didn't matter. And that's why we were doing those door-to-door canvassing, to find out, were you home that night?
Neighbors were looking at neighbors, so here's this friendly town where now it's like, did you have something to do with this, or do you know somebody? The town had taken a turn. It was no longer the friendly Mayberry. It was a town now where a girl had disappeared and they don't know who did it, how it happened.
Stranger abductions are very, very rare. We were looking at everything. We reached out to her father and spoke with him. He lives in the Tennessee area.
Please, just bring my daughter home. You know, give us a peace of mind. Let her go unharmed. Thank you.
We talked to anybody and everybody that was out and about that day that we could find. We talked to the kids, we talked to her friends, we talked to kids that she went to school with that weren't even there. We interviewed her teachers. I mean, we were talking to anybody that might have information that could possibly give us an indication as to what had happened. Everyone knew who Lindsey was. I mean, at that time in 2009, she was somebody who was part of the local kids that played in the park, and so the teachers knew her, the coaches knew her, the business owners knew her. We talked to her mom extensively, we talked to her brother extensively, you know, all of her friends, any extended family, just to see if there was any conversations that they had had with her, any concerns that Lindsey would have expressed to anybody about anything were something that we wanted to know about. We spent a lot of time getting to know the family and talking to them about all of those things, and then again just talking to her friends and teachers and all of those people just to see if she had anything that she was concerned about, any new people in her life, new friends that she had, you know, knew somebody that might have approached her and tried to befriend her.
She hadn't been communicating with anyone that they were able to find.
One of the first things we did was look at how many registered sex offenders lived in the community, and then I expanded that out 5 miles, and then 5 miles to 10 miles, and then of course when you get out 20 miles, well, now you're incorporating the city of Olympia that is a much, much larger population, and so we were building this huge database that could be mined for information to see who talked to who and when we talked to them and who was out and about. But we didn't have that one nugget that was going to unravel this.
The focus was on basically everybody in town. And all the way back to, in fact, Melissa Baum. I mean, everybody was looking at her, whether she had something to do with it or was careless in letting her be out there.
At first it devastated me. I'd find myself arguing with people and feeling the need to defend myself. And it really hurt me, a lot of the things that people said. Like, apparently I was a drug addict and I sold Lindsey for a drug debt. Well, anybody that's ever known me knows that I have never in my life done drugs. But it still hurt me, and I always felt like I needed to defend it. I did take a polygraph test. I didn't want them wasting time on me. I knew that I'd be the one they'd be looking at, and I had nothing to hide. I opened up my entire world to them. They had the logins to my online accounts, to my email. They had access to my phones. I let them into everything.
I know that Melissa, for a time, people were talking about how she was raising feral kids and how just let them run amok and loose, and there's really no truth to that. It's not unusual for kids to walk through town by themselves.
There's all the eyes on you, like all the neighbors. They know you. They know your kids, and they might say to your child, "Get on home," you know. Have you called your mom? But it's not the kind of place where you'd think that she would be snatched up by someone in a car, that she would be pulled into a house, that she would be a target of a pedophile. Those are the kinds of things that would be the farthest thing from your mind in a little town like McCleary.
Big rumor was the dust-up between Lindsey and her brother over a bicycle the night she disappeared. And there was a lot of gossip about, well, you know, maybe it was the brother, which again, there was nothing to any of that.
My son got the worst of it. You know, I could deal with what came at me a lot better than what came at him. A lot of people accused him of being the one that did it and that I was covering up. And that devastated him in so many ways. And it didn't help that he has the autism. And he harbored guilt anyways because he'd been mad at her and he left to come home. And he felt like if they hadn't been fighting, he would have been with her and she would have been safe. I've always told him if somebody really wanted her, they would have hurt him too, just to get her.
A lot of rumors, but on the other hand, you tend to focus on the negative sometimes. But when Lindsey went missing, I think the thing to focus on is just how the community as a whole came together to find her. People from McClary and out way outside heard about Lindsey's disappearance and just showed up in town and just said, hey, how can I help? What can I do?
We paired up local detectives with FBI agents, and then they worked in tandem to try to knock on every door in McClary, talk to every person, to walk the route that we believe she would have been on to go from her friend's house to her home, and then see what there was in the way of any kind of camera surveillance, both privately and public, businesses, to try to identify and develop persons of interest, and at the same time, see if we can't come up with a witness or some idea of what happened.
There are all kinds of theories that perhaps it was a stranger that drove through. But the fact of the matter is, it's several blocks off the main highway, so you would have to really take a detour to be on the road that she was on. And so when they talk about who did this, it really leads to, they believe that it might have been somebody that Lindsey would have known, somebody from the town. Even though, as we see in her smiling face, she was very friendly, but she wasn't careless. So she wouldn't have gotten into a car, they don't believe, of a stranger's.
Obviously, Ring doorbells weren't in existence in 2009. The availability of CCTV footage just wasn't there.
A business at the busy intersection along Lindsey's route home did have cameras.
It's just a short walk home from a friend's house on a hot summer night. 10-year-old Lindsey Baum has less than a half mile to go to get home. Down quiet residential streets, across one of the main roads in town, and past a gas station. It usually takes her about 10 minutes.
Did you find any witnesses who had seen her walking along that path?
We found two. One lady who was getting home from work, and another that was just passing through the area, that were almost certain that they saw her. The description they gave matched her description, and the point that they saw Lindsey was within a block or so of Maple and 4th Street.
The halfway point, that was it. It was like nothing from that point on.
They figured she walked her normal route down the street and gone.
There was really nothing at all to go on. They had search dogs come out and tracked her a certain distance, but they didn't find any indication of her, of Lindsey, as far as, maybe an article of clothing or hair, anything. It was pretty eerie how there seemed to be no trace of her whatsoever once she left her friend's house.
At the point she was last seen, Lindsey was almost to a busy intersection with a gas station on the corner. A gas station with video cameras inside and out. There's no video of Lindsey, However, investigators want to identify everyone else captured on camera.
If you came in and bought something, if you got gas, if you were a customer in any way, shape, or form, if you just stopped in to say hi to the clerk because that was your friend, we just wanted to talk to those people because you would have been obviously out and about at that period of time that we're really focused on, that we're still focused on. And so we were able to identify almost everyone because, again, small town, everybody knows everybody, to walk the route that we believe she would have been on to go from her friend's house to her home, and then see what there was in the way of any kind of camera surveillance, both privately and public, businesses, all of those things that you see law enforcement do to try to see if we can't come up with a witness or some idea of what happened. The goal was to take a snapshot of the city of McClary as though you were hovering over it that night at 9:30 and see who was out, what cars were in the area, who was driving around.
One local man is under scrutiny after he's seen on video at a local market, despite telling police he'd been out of town.
He told me he doesn't know what happened to Lindsey. He doesn't remember being there. And he said, if they have proof that I was there, I'm not going to dispute that.
Some of those things, came down to people just human nature, not wanting to be involved, or some people honestly didn't remember that they had done that. They said, God, I don't, now that, yeah, I did run to the store. Now I totally forgot about it, but I did.
If you're there and you say you're somewhere else, somebody's going to find that out. And for whatever reason, one young man was right on that path as well that Lindsey would have taken, and he said, he was somewhere else. They looked at several people that just flat out lied about where they were that night, and that puts you on the A list of people that they need to run down and check out. They've been through several yards, they've had helicopter searches, they've been through ponds, and still no firm suspect as yet.
To this day, though, there's a car and a person with a boy that walked into the store at the Shell station that was right at the time that we were and are focused on. We've never identified. There was a gray Honda Ridgeline pickup truck that came into the Shell station right about the time we were interested, and there was a man and a young boy that came in. We don't know whether they had anything to do with the Honda Ridgeline pickup, and we don't know if, who they are. We were able to identify everybody else and actually have conversations with them, but those remain unknown.
It never made any sense to me how she could have been snatched in the middle of town and nobody saw anything. So in my mind, to this day, I feel like it had to have been somebody she either knew or thought she could trust.
When we look at a missing child investigation, especially the age of when Lindsey was taken, what her age was, we typically think it's sexual in nature, and oftentimes these individuals who do take children of that age, they're looking to satisfy their need as quickly as possible.
I told them I wanted them to take the city and turn it upside down and shake it and see what they could find. We took the main cell tower that services that area so that we could look at subscriber information for those numbers. We went to the gas stations and the businesses that were open and got all the credit card receipts from that night. We talked to anybody and everybody that we could think of and looked at all the data that we could get that would show who was in and around McClary at that time.
We got a tip that these people saw Lindsey Baum in the back of a car, and we had units flying down the highway doing over 100 miles an hour trying to intercept this vehicle, and we finally did, and I believe one of the deputies came up and told me, he says, Chief, this was a psychic. I felt all kind of different things, anger. I mean, I just put 8 officers' lives in danger on the highway, and, we were intercepting, and no one told me this was from a psychic.
A man said that a friend of his told him that he ran over a girl walking on the street, and that he took the body, put it in his vehicle, and drove out to the ocean and put the body in a crab pot and threw it out off of Westport and Ocean Shores. A couple of year later, they found a skull in a crab pot, and they believed it was a young child.
It took a long time before we were able to finally find the source of the original story. He admitted that he made the whole thing up and that he did it to get back at somebody he thought had done him wrong. And the remains were identified as human, but they were an adult, and it was from long ago based on the aging of the remains.
About a year after Lindsey is reported missing, 130 miles away in Portland, Oregon, 7-year-old Kyron Horman disappears after his elementary school science fair on June 4th, 2010.
Ages were comparable, the circumstances were similar, genders were different, but my detectives and the detectives with the Multnomah County Sheriff's Office in Portland, Oregon area all worked together. And the FBI agents that were assigned to that case and the FBI agents that were assigned to our case, I mean, there was a lot of dialogue because of the similarities in those two cases. Both of them continued to occasionally have conversation with one another to see where things are going.
We've done extensive study and extensive research on the typical subject of somebody who would take a girl of that age. Typically what it fits is, I believe over 70% of those individuals are male, and typically they're white male individuals. 70% of them or so have a criminal history, prior convictions for possible breaking and entering, any kind of sexual deviancy in the past as well. Oftentimes these guys are on the fringe of society socially, have issues with interacting with other adults, and they have other sexual fantasies that cause them to want to eventually actually commit the crimes.
It was long days. Myself and a number of other officers worked 45, 50 days in a row with no time off. And the average officer was putting in anywhere from 12 to 16 hours a day. And I was having to tell people to go home to take a break just to regenerate because, we were wearing people out. And everyone became so invested in the investigation. And as time wore on, it becomes personal.
Lindsey's mother is fighting her own battle to keep her daughter's case in the public eye.
She was there organizing, and so even though the pain of losing a child, where sometimes you might be recluse and go into seclusion, she was out front and center.
I know she's alive, but I need her home. Somebody that tells me I'm better off not knowing has never been in my position. I want to know. I want to know what happened to my daughter. I want to know who did it. And until I get that, I'm not going to let it drop. Somebody's going to pay for what happened to my daughter.
She had a lot of questions about what she could actually do herself to push along the investigation. Rose Winquist, who's my investigator, and has been for decades, has been working with law enforcement. And she also has the capacity to do a lot more, mapping of suspects, comparing different information, social media searches, all kinds of searches on individuals, comparing information on people's alibis, comparing different statements. I mean, she can do things that the law enforcement agency like Grays Harbor which is a pretty depressed county, may not have the time or the manpower to accomplish.
There's a lot of people that don't want anything to do with law enforcement. Those are going to be the ones that would rather talk to Rose.
In 2017, there's a disturbing case in Seattle about 80 miles away that may have a connection to Lindsey's disappearance.
Seattle police investigators returned to the home of three elderly brothers, Edwin, Thomas, and Charlie Emery, all charged with possession of child pornography. Further south in Shelton, at a home of a deceased fourth brother, there was a startling find. A clue found inside may be connected to the disappearance of Lindsey Baum. They found a flyer, the missing person flyer of Lindsey Baum. And so they were looked at very seriously. And when you think if indeed she was abducted, a kindly older man might be something that would break through the ice of, a cautious Lindsey Baum.
Charges are dropped against the eldest brother, Charles Emery, who has dementia and is determined to be unable to aid in his own defense. The two remaining brothers pled guilty to 2 counts of second-degree child pornography charges. None of the brothers are charged in connection to the Baum case.
At the end of the day, there was no evidence to link them to this investigation.
The detective on the case called me at work. I knew something was up.
I got word that there was a press conference to update the Baum case. I didn't know what it was about.
I had completely convinced myself that she was going to come home. It is the most lonely feeling that you could ever imagine, to not know where your child is. I think any parent that's ever lost their kid in the grocery store or the mall in that horror, that feeling never goes away when somebody steals your child. That can't breathe, panicked feeling is 24/7.
On May 10th, 2018, the Grays Harbor County Sheriff's Department calls a news conference about the Lindsey Baum case, almost 9 years after Lindsey's disappearance. It's not just members of the media, but also local residents who show up at the McClary Community Center to hear the announcement.
I'm here today to share with you that we've brought Lindsey home. We've recovered her. Sadly, she was not recovered as we and her family had hoped and prayed these last 9 years.
There was hope right up to the point where there was no longer reason for hope. You could feel the oxygen get sucked out of the room, you hear gasps from some of the people. It was pretty devastating, even though after all those years, not surprising, but still upsetting to everybody who held out hope.
I thought, damn, who could do that? What kind of person?
Her remains were recovered in September of 2017, unknowingly, by some hunters in a remote portion of eastern Washington. Those remains were turned over to local authorities, who in turn released them to the FBI, where they were confirmed to be human and sent to the FBI lab in Quantico, Virginia, for analysis for DNA. Because the remains were not associated with a specific criminal investigation, they were not analyzed for DNA until just recently. So just in the recent week were we notified that the DNA collected from the remains matched the DNA submitted to the lab in 2009.
The remains were found in a steep, heavily wooded area in Kittitas County.
The remains were obviously skeletal. It was just the remains of the skull that were found, and so that's what was submitted to the lab.
This is how much remains I got back of Lindsey. 2 of these, one for me and one for my son. I do have a little urn, but these were filled. So everything on there says unknown. It doesn't have a date of death. It has a found date. And it has cause of death, homicidal violence. Everything else is unknown. They have her place of death is Kittitas County, but that's only because that's where her remains were found. I don't think she died in Kittitas County. But other than that, every single box on her death certificate says unknown.
There were some searches, some pretty intensive searches done shortly after they were identified. But steep, hilly area, a lot of snow in the wintertime, a lot of runoff in the springtime. They don't know where that tiny bit of remains would have originated from. They have no idea. That's another frustrating part for investigators is, how did she get here? Where's the rest of the remains?
It's remote. It's only visited by hunters, hikers, cross-country skiers. It's not off the main road. It is deep in the woods. And so, if you connect this person in McClary and who knows how to hunt, who knows how to hike, who goes up into the woods, that's your person.
This took the innocence away from the city of McClary. I mean, it was a little town, still is. It was the little town where everybody knew everybody. Kids ran around, everybody watched over everybody's children. People didn't lock their doors. I mean, it was a little town with a very small police agency that was very innocent.
If you drive through McClary to this day, you will see a lot of signs and banners throughout the town with pictures of Lindsey.
This is an investigation that really has become one of those cases where you talk about it every day. Young detectives that I've newly promoted, one of the first things they're told to do is to go through this case, to look at all the different things that have occurred with fresh eyes.
We have a mountain of information that we compiled at the beginning of this investigation. Times have changed. Over the last 10, 12 years, we have developed further investigative techniques that we try to revisit the information that was attained at the time of the actual abduction, and we look at it with fresh eyes, through fresh technology, and through fresh information.
The person that did this is still out there, and somebody has an idea or a feeling or that gut sense that someone, whether it's a friend, a relative, a neighbor, a coworker, somebody that they've crossed paths within their life, they're thinking might have something to do with this. And so those are the people that we ask to come forward.
Just one little break and they can solve this.
It could just be the smallest thing that could fit all the pieces together. But if you've got the answers that a family's waiting for, why would you not report that?
There are bad people out there, I hate to say that, but there's some evil going on out there. And for someone to take a young child like that and who knows what she might have gone through, is those people need to be found.
Do you allow yourself to think about what Lindsey would be doing now?
All the time.
Yeah.
All the time. I think about it. I think about, what would you look like today? What would you be doing? Would you have started vet school now? Would you have kids now? Would you be married? I think about it all the time. An entire future was taken. It wasn't just a 10-year-old's life. It was her future. It was my future. It was my son's future. They stole that from all of us. And Lindsey would have made her mark on the world. She was a go-getter.
Lindsey Baum's murder is still unsolved.
Wonder if I could bring them to live. I could bring my lover. And baby, you make me wait. Now here I go, going back on the road. Now here I go, going back on the road. Now here I go, going back on the road. Now here I go, going back on the road. Waiting you back there again. Play the music back there again. I saw the looking out of the window. Wonder if I could bring them down. If I could bring my love now, baby, you made.
Shorty, if you really wanna go, baby, then you gotta take me the mess. I tried to soak in all the years and take it all in, but I come up for a breath and cry. I gave my drama, gave my simple, gave my friends a helping hand. I bet you know that they are dead. I wish I could tell you this. The more we talk, the talk is not a tongue. The more we talk, the talk is not a tongue. I did not come this far for any stronger. All of a sudden there was nothing left. Well, last night a doctor found you were lying. I never meant to keep you alive. There might be stuff we said